So tonight's video is going to focus on muscles, and it's basically just going to be an introduction to muscles, the different types of muscle, what they do, a little bit about different types of muscle contractions, and then we'll get more into the details as we continue to move through the chapter. So let's take a look at muscle functions first. So we have four basic muscle functions. The first one obviously being movement. Okay, so with movement of muscles are going to work by pulling on bones. Muscles will never push, they will always pull on the bones. Okay, if we remember when we did joints, we talked about how joints allowed for muscle movement, allowed for movement of the bones, and the muscles will cross those joints and be able to then pull and cause movement there. Muscles also help us maintain our body temperature. They generate heat. Every time we do a muscle contraction, we generate more heat. This is why when we're cold, we start to shiver, so that we do these little tiny muscle contractions, and each one of those is generating heat. So muscle tissue is very important for maintaining our body temperature, okay, and generating body heat. Muscles also help us maintain our posture. They're what help you sit upright in your chair, stand upright, not basically just be a big puddle of goo. Okay? While your bones act as a support system, your bones would still not stand up straight without the muscles helping maintain that posture. And in addition to movements, when muscle cross the joint, they also help stabilize the joint. Okay? This is a very terrible femur, right? And here's the top of the tibia. So we've got a knee joint here. When those muscles cross that joint there, those muscles are also, in addition to pulling and causing the movement, they are also helping to stabilize and keep that joint steady. Our first muscle type that we're going to look at here is skeletal. And if y'all remember from when we did microscopes, there were three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We're going to briefly touch on cardiac and smooth in just a moment. And then after that, everything is coming back to skeletal. We're going to be looking at how these muscles cause movement, exactly what movements they cause, what joints they're affecting, what bones, that kind of thing. So some reminders about skeletal muscle is that it's voluntary. Voluntary meaning that you control it. Your brain says, I want to contract this muscle. Now, it could be your subconscious brain. You may not realize that your brain is doing that. For instance, if you're sitting up in a chair right now, your brain is telling some of the muscles in your back and in your core to contract. And you don't have to think about that, kind of like breathing. But your brain is still doing it, right? You still control it. Skeletal muscle is also striated. If you remember from looking under the microscope, if you remember what striated was, right? It was all those little stripes, right? Skeletal muscle was the one that had all those different stripes in there. And those striations are going to be important when we get into a little bit more detail on the microscopic level of how the muscle actually works to produce a contraction. Skeletal muscle is also multinucleate. So multi meaning many or more than one, right? And nucleate being a nucleus. Skeletal muscle cells are humongous. They're really, really long. Okay? As our muscles grow and develop, these muscle cells are formed from multiple cells fusing together. That's why I have multiple nuclei in there, so that I get this really long cell, like a cell that runs the entire length of my thigh, right? Or the entire length of my arm, so that it can, cause the movement. So they're going to have more than one nucleus in them. Skeletal muscle is also surrounded by connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue helps support, helps stabilize. So skeletal muscle is surrounded by connective tissue, with the innermost layer being our endomysium. This myo right here, okay, myo, whenever you see that, myo is muscle. And if you remember, endo is inside. So the endomysium is the membrane that is the innermost membrane on the muscle. If you look at our picture over here on the right, you'll see I have a muscle fiber that I can pull out there. The endomysium is what surrounds the muscle fiber. So all of these, let's try a different color than red. All of these individual muscle fibers are surrounded by endomysium. So endomysium would be around this individual muscle fiber here. So endomysium is going to surround the muscle fibers. Paramecium means around. Peri is around. So paramecium is around the muscle, what we call the fascicle. That may be a little bit hard to see in that picture, the spelling. Okay, the fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. So it's a group of muscle fibers. So I've got this is a fascicle here, there's a fascicle here. All these blobs of muscle fibers are fascicles. And so each one of those fascicles are surrounded by the paramecium. Our epimecium, epi means upon, right? So epimecium is going to surround all those fascicles. Okay, so the epimecium, you see it labeled right here. The epimecium is kind of surrounding the muscle itself, right? It's wrapping all these fascicles together. Okay, and then on top of that epimecium, you're going to see what we call fascia. Fascia is going to be another thin layer on top that's going to help blend in to help form these tendons. The fascia is going to help form the tendons, which are going to anchor into the bone, right? The tendon is what helps anchor the muscle into the bone because the muscle has to be anchored into the bone for it to be able to pull on the bone. So you're going to have these layers as we expand upon the muscle. Endomysium around the individual fiber, peri around the fascicle, epi around the muscle itself, and then the fascia on top of the epimecium, wrapping all of it up and then blending into the bone to help anchor the muscle. So again, if we think back to our microscopes, we also looked at smooth and cardiac under the microscopes. You can see our skeletal here in the first picture. You can see all the stripes or the striations. All right, you can see the multiple nuclei within the muscle cell. So now if we move to smooth muscle is involuntary. You don't get to control that. Smooth muscle you'll find in your hollow organs, things like blood vessels, your bladder, your intestines, your stomach. These are not things you get to control. You don't get to eat some food and then you have to send a message to your stomach that says mix that up. And then you send a message to your intestines that says push that forward further. You don't control those things. So this is involuntary muscle. There are no striations on this. So if you look at the smooth muscle here in the second picture, and if you think back to your microscopes where we looked, there were no stripes or striations. Remember those cells were they got kind of pointy at the ends, spindle shaped, and they're only going to have one nucleus. Okay, so our cardiac muscle is going to be kind of a mix of the two. It's also involuntary, so we have no control over that cardiac muscle, but it is striated. It's going to have the stripes just like the skeletal muscle has. It has 1 to 5 nuclei. So like smooth muscle, it could have one. Like skeletal muscle, it could have more than one. You're going to find cardiac muscle in the heart only. So one of the things that people sometimes mix up is they think that I'm going to find cardiac muscle in the blood vessels as well, but I'm not. The blood vessels are a hollow organ, so they actually have the smooth muscle in them, and the cardiac muscle, while it is hollow, is the only place that I'm going to see. The heart, while it is hollow, is the only place I'm going to see the cardiac muscle. One of the things that makes your cardiac muscle stand out are these intercalated discs. If you again remember from our microscope pictures, they were like thicker, heavier looking striations or stripes. These are really important in cardiac muscle because they help spread the signal very quickly. Okay? We want our heart to contract as one unit, okay? Not in kind of a wave type fashion or like a kind of fashion. We want it all to contract at the same time so we get one nice, good, strong contraction to make sure we pump the blood. And so these intercalated discs really help that contraction signal spread very quickly to every single cell in the cardiac muscle. So some properties of muscle is muscle is extensible. It has this property called extensibility, which basically means that I can stretch it out, which is important, right? If we think about when we are doing, when we're exercising, right, one of the most important things we need to do is stretch our muscles out. So muscle has the ability to stretch, and then it's also elastic. It has the ability to snap back. So I can bend a joint, stretch a muscle over that joint, and then that muscle will snap back. right? When I straighten that muscle out, that muscle now will shorten, be smaller again. It will not stay like all stretched out. Right? So that is elasticity is very important for our muscles, that ability to return to its original shape after you stretched it out. Muscles also have irritability. They have the ability to respond to a stimulus. In particular, the stimulus from your nervous system that says, hey, it's time to contract. That does count as a stimulus. So they're able to stretch, they're able to return to their original shape, they respond to the stimulus, and then they can shorten, okay? Or they can contract, right? That's my contractility. Their ability to shorten, which is what allows them, again, to pull on the bones and to cause movement. So the last thing we're going to talk about with muscles are these different types of contractions. And again, in particular, we are now focused on skeletal muscle. So these are specific types of contractions that I'm going to find in skeletal muscle. So the first one is our concentric contraction. This is what we typically think of with a muscle contraction. We can see it in the second picture here. With a concentric contraction, I produce tension. Tension is force on the muscle. So I produce tension and the muscle itself shortens. It gets shorter in length. You see the bulge forming there in the muscle. So the muscle itself shortens and I'm able to produce tension or force. And when I do a concentric contraction, I have an agonist, which is my main muscle that is doing the movement, right? The main muscle that is performing the contraction. So for instance, in our picture here, we have a bicep curl happening. So my agonist here is this bicep muscle on the front of my arm. And my antagonist, this is going to be the opposing muscle group. And the opposing muscle group is important here because it's going to need to relax or stretch out so that I don't tear something on the back side of my arm here. So again, in our picture, our agonist that's performing the main muscle contraction is the bicep, where our triceps would be our antagonist, the one that's going to need to relax so it can stretch out. An eccentric muscle contraction, so we see that happening in this bottom picture here. An eccentric muscle contraction is going to produce tension, but it's going to lengthen the muscle as it produces tension. If I'm doing a bicep curl, I don't curl it up like I did in picture B and then just like flop the weight back down, right? I'd break my elbow. When I am lowering the weight back down, this bicep is still exerting force or tension while it controls it, but now the muscle is lengthening as it produces that force or tension. It's not pulling, right? The triceps is helping pull, the backside is helping pull. It's not pushing, I'm sorry. It's not pushing on the forearm. The triceps is pulling on the forearm, but it's helping control that movement and keep it nice and smooth and steady. And then our last one here are these isometric contractions. Iso means same, right? And so an isometric contraction, this is what we see happening in this first picture here. I produce tension, but the muscle doesn't move. It stays exactly the same. Think about if you were trying to push down a brick wall. Okay? Your muscles don't, you could be pushing with all your force, exerting all the tension in the world. And those muscles aren't going to move because you can't, the brick isn't moving. Okay? So if I took a weight and I just held in this picture here, there's holding the weight out. Okay? I have to exert tension on the muscle so that the weight doesn't fall or I don't drop it, but the muscle isn't changing in length. There's no actual movement happening here. Okay? And these kinds of muscle movements can be very beneficial. They can help strengthen muscle. You do these a lot in the core for stability. Okay? So this is all we wanted to talk about with muscles. Just kind of get an intro, get thinking in this direction, and we'll start picking apart a little bit more how they work in our next video as we move forward.